Chapter 16, Part 3. The period between 1870 and 1890 is the only time in American history described in a derogatory way as the Gilded Age, after the title of an 1873 novel co-authored by Mark Twain. Gilded means covered with a layer of gold, suggesting that the golden surface deceptively obscures a core of little real value. The Gilded Age thus referred to the extraordinary economic growth of the period and the corruption caused by the corporate domination of politics, as well as the oppression of others and the competition for riches. Americans in this period, in a world in which only a few European governments extended universal male suffrage, saw their nation as a beacon of democracy. Yet, the power of corporations, which seemed removed from democratic controls, raised unsettling questions for Americans' belief that political freedom meant popular self-government. Political corruption was pervasive. New railroad corporations wielded great influence in state legislatures, and often legislatures in the West held stock or directed mining and lumber companies. Urban politics was often dominated by corrupt political machines, such as the Tweed Ring in New York, led by boss William M. Tweed, which both robbed the city of millions of dollars and built alliances with businessmen and labor, and also provided aid to the urban poor and unemployed. In national politics, many lawmakers supported bills benefiting companies in which they had invested or from which they received stocks or salaries. The most famous case of corruption unfolded during the Grant administration. In the Credit Mobilier scandal, a corporation formed by Union Pacific Railroad stockholders made contracts with itself at government expense and for huge profits, and gave stock to influential politicians. And the whiskey ring in the Grant administration united Republican officials, tax collectors, and whiskey manufacturers in a scheme that defrauded the federal government of millions in tax dollars. The Civil War's legacy powerfully shaped national politics and elections. Republicans found support in the North, Midwest, and agrarian West among members of revivalist churches, Protestant immigrants, and blacks. Union veterans organizations were a strong Republican base. By the 1890s, pensions for Union soldiers and their widows and children was the largest item in the federal budget. After 1877, Democrats dominated the South and found support among Catholics, especially Irish Americans, in cities. The parties were closely divided, and in most presidential elections between 1876 and 1892, the margin separating the major candidates was less than 1% of the popular vote. In 1874, Democrats won control of the House of Representatives, which started a period of political stalemate in which little new legislation was passed for 20 years. Only briefly did either party control both the Congress and the White House. One-term presidents followed: Rutherford B. Hayes in 1876, James A. Garfield in 1881, succeeded by Chester A. Arthur after his assassination that year, Grover Cleveland in 1884, Benjamin Harrison in 1888, and Cleveland again in 1892. American politics, with high numbers of eligible voters voting in contested elections, seemed healthy in a number of ways. Yet, the political structure could not effectively confront rapid growth and economic transformation. The federal government remained small and had limited regulatory power compared to today. Both parties became controlled by party managers closely aligned with business interests. Republicans supported a high tariff to protect American industry and pursued a fiscal policy based on reducing spending, paying off the nation's debt, and withdrawing from circulation all greenbacks, the paper money issued during the Civil War. The Democrats opposed a high tariff, but because the leadership was still tied to New York banks and finance, they opposed demands from their agricultural base for an increase in the money supply. In 1879, the United States returned to the gold standard. Paper currency could again be exchanged for gold at a fixed rate. Republican economic policies, which reduced foreign competition in manufacturing and left banks, not the government, to regulate the money supply, favored Eastern industrialists and bankers and disadvantaged Southern and Western farmers who had to pay high prices for factory goods while prices for their crops dropped. There were a few reforms in the Gilded Age. In 1883, the Civil Service Act substituted a merit system for federal employees, which replaced political appointments with competitive examinations. In 1887, responding to protests against unfair railroad practices, Congress created the Interstate Commerce Commission to ensure that rates charged to farmers and merchants were reasonable. The ICC was the first federal agency to regulate the economy, but it could not itself set rates, and thus had little effect. Though Congress soon passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which banned combinations and practices restraining free trade, its language was too vague and its laws to be enforced, and it had little effect. Though national politics offered few solutions to economic problems, politics was vibrant and fluid at the state and local levels. After the Civil War, northern state governments expanded their role in the economy by launching public works programs that created jobs, and they assumed more responsibility for public health, education, and welfare. Third parties experienced some success. The Greenback Labor Party, which proposed that the federal government keep greenbacks in circulation, thus leaving money for investment and giving the government control over the money supply, led some local governments in the 1870s. Protests over railroad policies among farmers and local merchants suffering very high freight rates led to the formation of the Patrons of Husbandry. Known as the Grange, founded in 1867, the Grange established cooperatives for storing and marketing farm goods in order to force railroads to lower their prices. In some states, the Grange pressured state legislatures to investigate railroad rates and, in some cases, regulate them. A resurgent labor movement also called for economic regulation in the form of 8-hour laws limiting the workday. Although a few state legislatures passed these laws, they lacked means of enforcement and had little effect. As the nation industrialized, Americans tried to understand the ways in which their society was changing. Debates over political economy engaged millions of Americans, not just economists, politicians, and academics, and thousands of books and pamphlets were published regarding the ethical and social consequences of industrialization and highly technical issues such as currency reform and land taxation. Many Americans believed that something was terribly wrong in the nation's social development, and their talk of better classes and dangerous classes became the rule as labor strife was recurrent. A number of states and even Congress established committees to investigate the changing relations between labor and capital, and many were shocked to learn that employers and workers distrusted each other and that workers complained of abuse and poverty. The emergence of a permanent class of wage earners challenged traditional American ideas of freedom. Did America still offer opportunities to ordinary citizens to gain economic independence? To many, it seemed that wage labor was no longer a temporary condition on the way to economic autonomy, nor did the West seem a refuge from deprivation in the East. Many Americans saw the concentration of wealth in this period as a natural sign of progress, and mainstream economics held that the wages were determined by supply and demand and should not be artificially changed by government or labor unions. The link between freedom and equality forged in the Revolution and strengthened by the Civil War no longer seemed relevant. Reformers in the liberal Republican movement, which challenged Grant in the 1872 elections, even argued that universal male suffrage was a mistake, as the poor and workers might use the vote to threaten property. Instead, they urged a return to property qualifications for the vote. The idea that some groups were superior to others, once based in racialized slavery, now reappeared in a scientific guise as a means to explain the success and failure of individuals and entire social classes. In 1859, British scientist Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, in which he posited a theory of evolution where plants and animals best able to adapt to their environment supplanted those less adaptable. Different thinkers simplified Darwin's theory and used his language of natural selection, the struggle for existence, and the survival of the fittest to address social problems. According to this school of thought, termed social Darwinism, evolution was a natural process in both nature and society. Government could only corrupt society by regulating the society or economy to the advantage of the poorer workers, who simply were less able to adapt to changing conditions. Social Darwinism believed giant corporations had evolved to become dominant in the economy because they had better adapted, and to restrict their operations would be to reverse progress. The depressions of the 1870s and 1880s did not dislodge popular opinion that the poor were responsible for their own poverty. In Gilded Age America, nearly half of all local governments offered no poor relief. Poverty, it was believed, was caused by a lack of character or absence of self-reliance. Thinkers, such as Yale's William Graham Sumner, argued that no one in a free society could make a claim for help from any other person, including through government assistance. Social Darwinism helped spread a negative definition of freedom, limited government, and unrestrained free markets, which became popular among business professional classes in the late 19th century. The idea of contract was central to this definition of freedom. Labor contracts reconciled freedom and authority in the workplace, and as long as independent individuals freely contracted with each other, neither government nor unions had a right to interfere with working conditions, nor could Americans legitimately complain that they had lost any freedom. Workers' demands that governments enforce an 8-hour day or provide unemployment relief struck liberals as a perversion of governmental authority that threatened liberty. The old idea of free labor as a celebration of the independent small producer in a society of equality and harmony became a defense of the unrestrained capitalist market. The courts played an important role in making liberty of contract essential to ruling definitions of freedom. The 14th Amendment allowed the federal government to overturn state laws that violated citizens' rights. By the 1880s, liberty of contract, not equality before the law regardless of race, came to define the meaning of this amendment. State and federal courts regularly struck down state laws that regulated business, such as maximum hour laws, as an illegal interference with the rights of employers to use their property as they saw fit and the rights of employees to choose the conditions of their work. Initially, the Supreme Court accepted laws regulating firms that represented a public interest, such as railroads, but the Supreme Court reversed itself, leading to the formation of the Interstate Commerce Committee, which lost many of its cases when they were taken to the court. The courts generally favored businesses whenever they complained of a loss of economic freedom, struck down laws granting workers' rights, and limited the reach of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Most famously, in Lochner v. New York, 1905, the Supreme Court struck down a state law establishing maximum hours for bakers, arguing that it interfered with the right of contract between employers and employees. Chapter 16, Part 4. Public debate in the late 19th century, more than any other point in American history, divided along class lines. The shift from debates over slavery and the status of former slaves to what one politician called the overwhelming labor question was clear in 1877, when Reconstruction ended and the first national strike began, the Great Railroad Strike. Railroad workers protesting pay cuts paralyzed rail traffic in much of the country. Militia units tried to force them back to work, and after troops fired on strikers and killed 20 in Pittsburgh, workers rioted and burned property, and strikers spread to other workplaces. General strikes brought Chicago and St. Louis to a halt. The event showed a new solidarity among workers and close ties between the Republican Party and the new class of industrialists. In the aftermath, the federal government built armories in major cities to help crush future uprisings. There was a new wave of labor organizing in the 1880s, and the Knights of Labor stood at its center. The Knights were the first labor group to organize unskilled workers as well as skilled, women and men, and blacks as well as whites, although the Knights on the West Coast excluded Asian immigrants. In its peak year, 1886, the Knights had around 800,000 members and involved millions of workers in strikes, boycotts, and political, social, and educational activities. Labor reformers in this era presented a wide range of hopes and demands, from anarchism and socialism to the 8th-hour day and a desire for a cooperative commonwealth. They all agreed that new social conditions were highly unequal and required drastic change. The labor movement challenged the prevailing definition of freedom as liberty of contract, arguing that Americans had lost control over their livelihoods and their government. Not just workers were dissatisfied with the social conditions. A sense of alarm at social changes wrought by industrial capitalism spread through all classes. Social thinkers offered many different ideas and blueprints for change, and at the end of the 19th century, an unprecedented number of utopian and dystopian novels were published, including Caesar's Column by Ignatius Donnelly, in which civilization was destroyed in a brutal war between workers and businessmen. The most popular book offerings remedied for the unequal distribution of wealth were Progress and Poverty of 1879 by Henry George, The Cooperative Commonwealth, 1884 by Lawrence Gronlund, and Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, 1888. All three books were bestsellers and spoke to the growing belief that American society was deeply flawed. Progress and Poverty had no direct influence on policy, but it attracted more attention than any other book on economics in American history. In the 1850s and 60s, Henry George had witnessed the monopolization of land in California. His book suggested that the major problem facing America was the growth of poverty alongside material progress, and his solution was the single tax, which would replace all other taxes with a tax on increases in land values. The single tax would be so high that it would prevent land speculation in the city and countryside. Although not all embraced his solution, many people were stirred by his identification of the social problem. Gronlund's book, The Cooperative Commonwealth, was the first to popularize socialism for an American audience. Socialism, the idea that private control of economic enterprises should be replaced by government ownership in order to ensure a fair distribution of the benefits of the wealth produced, was a major political force in Western Europe in the late 19th century. But in the U.S., where private property was seen as essential to individual freedom, socialism was mostly confined to immigrants whose foreign language writings reached few people. Gronlund was the first to Americanize socialism. While Karl Marx had predicted that socialism would be achieved through a working-class revolution, Gronlund believed that it would be achieved by peaceful evolution, and thus made it seem more acceptable to middle-class Americans terrified by class conflict and the prospect of social revolution. Socialism was not popular until the early 20th century, but Gronlund's work prepared an audience for Bellamy's Looking Backward, which promoted socialism even as Bellamy eschewed the term by calling his socialism nationalism. In Bellamy's Utopian novel, a man falls asleep in 1888 and awakes in the year 2000. In a world in which cooperation has replaced class conflict and economic competition, and in which inequality and liberty as defined by liberty of contract had been banished, Bellamy insisted freedom was a social condition resting on interdependence, not autonomy. Bellamy's high authoritarian utopia, everyone would be conscripted into a great industrial army controlled by a single government operation, is chilling today, but it inspired hundreds of nationalist clubs whose members sought the abundance of industrial capitalism without its inequalities. The clergy also became a source of criticisms of social Darwinism and laissez-faire notions of freedom. While most Protestant preachers continued to attack individual sin, a new social gospel took shape in the writings of men like Walter Rauschenbausch, a New York Baptist minister, and Washington Gladden, a congressional clergyman in Columbus, Ohio. They argued that freedom and spiritual self-development required an equalization of wealth and power, and that unregulated capitalism degraded Christian brotherhood. Adherents tried to minister to the needs of the urban poor and attacked child labor and promoted better working-class housing and health and safety laws. The social conflicts of the age seemed to culminate in the great labor uprisings of 1886. Western Railroad Union's successful strike against lines controlled by Jay Gould, a powerful financier, inspired workers to join the Knights of Labor by the hundreds of thousands. On May 1, 1886, 350,000 workers across the country went on strike and protested for the 8-hour day. May 1st, known as May Day thereafter, became an annual holiday of parades and protests by workers around the world. In Chicago, where vibrant labor movements brought together radical socialists and anarchists, immigrant workers, and native-born anti-monopoly laborites, a strike by iron molders at the giant McCormick's plant that produced agricultural machinery turned violent. Company strike breakers and private police battled the strikers, and on May 3, 1886, 4 strikers were killed by police. A rally held the next day to protest their deaths ended in a bomb explosion. To this day, no one knows the identity of the bomber, and police opened fire, leading to the deaths and injuring more police and bystanders. Police in Chicago and elsewhere used the bombings as an opportunity to arrest and suppress labor radicals. The McCormick strike ended in defeat, and 8 anarchists, mostly immigrants, were charged with the bombing with little evidence and flawed proceedings that they were convicted. 4 were hanged, 1 committed suicide, and the remaining 3 were imprisoned until their sentences were commuted several years later. The Haymarket martyrs soon became symbols of labor's bloody struggle for rights in America. The Haymarket Affair took place amid multiple efforts across the country by workers, mostly in the Knights of Labor, to run candidates and organize work-based parties at the local and state levels. The most celebrated campaign took place in 1886 in New York, where Henry George ran for mayor of the United Labor ticket and almost defeated the Democratic candidate. The events of 1886 suggested that labor might become a powerful political force. In fact, the Knights of Labor quickly declined after 1886. Unions began to avoid politics, and the Democrats and Republicans proved successful at winning workers' votes. Nevertheless, the events of the Gilded Age marked a contest over freedom and its social conditions between the forces of social Darwinism and laissez-faire and those who supported collective efforts to establish industrial freedom.